Hello and welcome to Man with a Movie podcast. My name's Daniel and I'm joined by my co-host Linus. And today we're talking about what is the biggest Oscar snub in this season, which happens to be Cocaine Bear, in my opinion. Really should have gone Best Picture, Director, cinematography, everything. Well, actually, I've heard my co-host is telling me this is not actually the episode that we had in mind. Why don't you introduce it yourself, since it seems like you have maybe a better idea? I can't imagine what that would be.
Yeah, you know me. I hate to disappoint people, but unfortunately, we're not going to be talking about Cocaine Bear today. I mean, we can, but maybe at some later point in the episode. And instead, we'll be ranking a bunch of film movements today, but we'll be ranking them on a specific criteria. We'll be ranking them based on how accessible they are to someone who maybe is not necessarily brand new to film, but maybe someone who's watching a lot of like modern day releases, keeping up with like the big awards, like big film festivals, and wants to see something, some older films, explore certain film movements. So we'll be taking a look at a few of these movements, and we'll try to rank them and see how we feel how accessible they are, basically.
Yeah, I think we have a few ground rules or like parameters for this ranking we got to establish first. So I guess when we're talking about accessibility, whom are we thinking of in mind? So I guess I'll pass it to you, but are you thinking someone who already has like some familiarity with these, or just someone completely new to this entirely?
Yeah, I tried to almost, so since I studied film studies in university, I essentially got like thrown in the deep end, and I got to explore some of, well, not necessarily explore, but I got a first taste of some of these movements while it was still pretty fresh to film, pretty green. I wasn't too familiar with most of them when I was sort of introduced to them in university. So I'm coming it almost from that similar point of view, like someone who has maybe seen some older films, but doesn't necessarily watch them regularly, mainly just watches, like I said, new releases, but wants to seek out a movement, wants to pick out a movement, and I essentially want to discuss and figure out which of these movements would be the best starting point, and which you maybe should save for later, or go in, but be a bit careful with what films you sort of pick and choose.
Yeah, I have one other. It might sound like a joke, but I have one other question: are you thinking of like the modern like Zoomer generation, the people that have like no attention span, which is somewhat what I've been thinking of, maybe because all of our attention spans have been kind of on the decline. But I mean, it's a little hard to think about, at least for me, like a single type of person who's new to film, because I feel like my rankings for all these movements will completely change depending on what people are already, exposed to in other arts, or have what other hobbies and things they do. If someone's completely like a casual film watcher and doesn't really engage in arts, I'd have completely different ratings from someone who is like deep into like music and paintings and whatnot, and then is just starting film for the first time. So I guess what's your take on that?
Yeah. Yeah, I do sort of take the Zoomer generation into consideration as well, with the melted attention spans. Not necessarily because I think like, oh, that's the person who I'm making this sort of tier list in mind, but I do think, especially for someone who's maybe more used to watching contemporary films, like contemporary American films specifically, they are a bit maybe faster than some of the European films. Like recently, I rewatched the Orson Welles documentary, The Arena, where he himself is sort of interviewed throughout the entire documentary. And I remember he said at one point in time that in his films, one of his strengths, like as he described it himself, was that he always knew when to end a shot. And when he contrasted himself with like European filmmakers, he said, oh, their takes go like on and on and on, because famously Orson Welles didn't really like a lot of like European films. So I do think that's like a factor, like the amount of sort of the amount of attention and maybe other things that you have to dedicate to actually enjoy some of the films here, that was definitely a factor that I took into consideration when grading these.
What would Orson Welles think? That's always a good question to ask myself about anything.
For somebody who has never had like the delight of hearing Orson talk about other filmmakers, do look up like one of those threads on Twitter where people have just compiled all the stuff he has said about other directors, because he is for the most part just absolutely roasting them. But the roasts are hilarious. It's one of the funniest things you'll ever read.
Oh man, yeah, he's such a great speaker. Like, they're directors obviously who hate each other, and they're a lot more blunt and I guess, I don't know what's the word, like mean about it. And Orson can take down someone, but say it in like somehow the most grandiose, eloquent way possible. Still, so he still comes off incredibly charming. So it's kind of unfair, but I digress. Okay, so I think we have a somewhat rough, at least, idea of whom we're recommending to, what we're trying to do. Why don't we, what sort of grades, what are some of these tiers that we're trying to rank these into?
Yeah, so the tiers, we have 5 tiers for this. The A tier, or like the top tier, would be everyone would love this. So this is the movement that literally anyone, like the aforementioned Zoomer, could jump into, and I think they would find some stuff that they would genuinely love. The next tier below that, the B tier, is titled Fun to Explore. So maybe has some duds. Some people might struggle a bit with this. Maybe it requires some buy-in from the viewer, but most of the stuff in the movement is really fun to watch, and it's an easy movement to engage with. Then the C tier can be challenging. It's not necessarily all the stuff isn't super challenging, but some stuff can be challenging, and it requires more from the audience to actually engage with the movement. Maybe you have to know a bit more history, a bit more trivia. Maybe you really have to understand how it influenced other films to get the most out of engaging with this movement. And that's why it can be a bit challenging. Then the tier below that, the D tier, is probably safe for later, which is essentially just, you can start with this movement, but you would get a lot more out of it if you engage with this movement a lot later in your sort of cinema journey, where maybe you have already familiarized yourself with certain other movements, and that's when you sort of delved into this movement, and you would probably get a lot more out of it. And then the final tier is the E tier, which is do not start with this movement. So this is sort of saved for those movements where if you're sort of delving into your first film movement and you're for the first time exploring some older cinema and you decide to start here for whatever reason, you would probably just get burnt out on films as a whole for a little while. So this is also almost like a save for later, but a more extreme save for later.
Yeah, it's just like the American grading system, A, B, C, D, and E. Well, I've always been wondering why they skipped E and went to F, but
true.
But anyways, but yeah, more or less, yeah, just descending order of accessibility. So we have, it looks like 7 movements we're going to talk about in this episode. We think there are obviously a lot more than 7 film movements in the history of film. And we might add on to this and rank them later. But I guess to keep this a more compact podcast, we started with 7 of the most well-known movements, wouldn't you say? Sure.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess it would also be worth mentioning that movements, anyone who has done like any research into film that will know that movements can be quite a contentious topic. Like even film genres can get quite contentious sometimes, but movements in particular, like a good example would be the French New Wave, where there are all these people that were supposedly part of the French New Wave, but then if you look into it a bit, there's actually like a divide in the French New Wave where like half the filmmakers are actually part of what's called the left bank movement, even though they all sort of came up at the same exact time. So it gets really confusing with some of these movements. Like sometimes a filmmaker is making films in the exact time frame that the movement is taking place, but he's just excluded from the movement because usually the people who come up with the movement definitions aren't the filmmakers themselves. It's just like some film journalist, some film critic who just like combines people, finds some similarities between them and calls it a movement, and that's how they usually come to be. So we're going to be taking quite a liberal definition to some of these movements. And if there's like any people who are like, does he belong here? Does he not? We're just going to say that, yeah, it probably does. We'll rake him in here. Come on in. Everyone's welcome.
Yeah, we'll discuss like all the, I guess, the major figures that we're thinking of when we consider these movements. Movements also are sometimes like a marketability term, especially when we start getting into the waves, like the new waves of X country. They just happen to be contemporaneous filmmakers, even sometimes not even all that contemporaneous in terms of when they actually started, but still they're sometimes just grouped together because they worked at the same country and roughly the same period, but might not have anything else really in common. But it's okay.
Yeah, for sure.
So how should we like, we have 7 movements. Should we go chronologically?
Yeah, I think let's go in chronological order. So the first movement that we have here is New Hollywood Cinema, which is the movement that started roughly in the late 60s, and it's most famous for filmmakers such as Scorsese, Cassavetes, Sidney Lumet, Francis Ford Coppola, Friedkin. Some Kubrick films are considered to be New Hollywood Cinema films. George Lucas is another New Hollywood Cinema guy. This is definitely one of the largest movements out there because it encompasses so many names. Since American cinema had such a big revival thanks to this movement. And some of the key films of the movement as well would include films such as like Taxi Driver, Godfather Part 1, and even something like the original Star Wars films as well. They would also be considered New Hollywood Cinema. And the key characteristics of this movement is that essentially Hollywood after the Golden Age, which was like 40s, 50s, it kind of experienced a few years of decline where a lot of their like sort of big budget blockbuster films kept sort of failing at the box office. So essentially what they did is when they noticed the success that French New Wave films were having in France and the Italian or post-Neorealism films were having in Italy, a lot of the filmmakers in the New Hollywood Cinema took some of those ideas from there, which were particularly to make films about anti-heroes and deal with these sort of darker and grittier themes. Especially a big factor that came into play was also sort of the end and decline of the Hays Code, which sort of freed up the possibilities to actually tackle some of these darker themes for these filmmakers. And that formed essentially the basis of this movement.
Yeah, just so the viewer's not confused, when we were discussing chronological order, we actually just ended up going in the order on our sheet here. So it's there will be older movements than this. It'll be like a non-linear art house film. So
yeah, true.
The New Hollywood cinema era was definitely a really radical thing because you had the Hays Code, which was, very restrictive, very backwards kind of in the Puritan kind of things that it was enforcing on filmmakers. And then that very much eroded by the time the 60s rolled around and culture was changing. You had violence and sexuality appearing in more and more cinema until this film called Bonnie and Clyde was released in 67 and kind of blew the doors off that, and things were not the same.
Like for people
genie was out of the bottle. Yeah.
For people who are not aware, if you've ever watched like a 40s film and you were wondering why is it that, like, for instance, a husband and wife, they go to bed and they like go to bed in separate beds. If you ever wonder why that's the case, that's actually not a 40s thing. It's just a thing because of the Hays Code. Like they placed such sort of restrictions on films that they couldn't really show anything that was like too violent, too sexual. All of that was forbidden. And New Hollywood Cinema broke a lot of those grounds. And when you look at the films like Taxi Driver, Godfather Part 1, obviously they deal like with really twisted, dark characters and a lot darker themes than any of the films that are like in the 50s or the 40s and whatnot.
Definitely. Yeah, and you mentioned the kind of later New Hollywood films. The earlier ones are quite interesting as well. And I'm kind of wondering, like, I have an overall grade, but some of these earlier films like Bonnie and Clyde, The Wild Bunch, Easy Rider, even 2001, like these are almost like almost of a different stripe than like the Star Wars, Taxi Driver, Jaws of types of films, which are, I think the budgets increased dramatically from like late 60s to the 70s, and that's partly why these films became like bigger, more epic.
For sure.
This kind of started as like as it's kind of a recurring theme with all these movements, but kind of there's just this kind of group of nobodies with no money or experience who are just making movies. And one book recommendation: anyone who's interested in this movement should check out. It's a famous book, but Easy Riders, Raging Bulls by Peter Biskin goes into a lot of kind of insane stories and details about what was happening in this period. So why don't we move into our overall grades? I can go first.
Go ahead.
I mean, I gave this an A. It's extremely accessible. Good luck finding a more well-beloved movement, I think, of these groups, especially among people who are new to film. So, I mean, there are definitely movements people would like more. I'm just saying that this one probably has the highest rate of success. Just think about the widespread love of Star Wars or The Godfather or Taxi Driver. I know I was certainly watching a lot of these when I was getting introduced to film, and I think a lot of people do too. How about you?
Yeah, I also think this would be the A tier. That everyone would love this, and I do think everyone would love this, and I think so for a couple of reasons. One is that just the variety of films and directors is absolutely insane in this movement. Like, yes, I know I really focused on like the darker ones that focus on the anti-heroes, but those aren't the only types of film. Like Star Wars isn't that kind of film. It's just like a sci-fi film. But also like you have Kubrick films. Some of them also snuck into New Hollywood cinema. You have someone like Sidney Lumet who also sort of reinvented his style because he was someone who also made films on sort of the latter end of the golden age, and he sort of changed up his style, and he came out of a film like Dog Day Afternoon, where he sort of was part of those first few people who were breaking ground in the new Hollywood cinema, and we really have just such insane variety of films and directors that I do think like everyone would genuinely love this, and they would find something in this movement to love. Like even if you don't like Scorsese and you like the sort of slower, more European type of film, you might really like Cassavetes. Like he did that thing in New Hollywood cinema. If you're not really messing with Coppola, you might really like Friedkin and the thrillers that he did in this time period. So I do think just the sheer variety and the amount of directors and films that it encompasses is really why it's almost like the benchmark for the everyone would love this tier. But also another big reason for me is that starting with this, the reason why I think this movement is such a great starting point is that it's a good basis to see why some of the other movements, some of the older movements are considered influential, because this is the movement where you will see a lot of that influence. Like if you start with this and then you go into French New Wave or Italian post-neorealism later, you'll see exactly how those Italian or French films influence some of the people in this movement. And that's why I think this is like a really great starting point for people.
So that's a pretty good segue to our next movement. And since we don't abide by the rules of chronology here, we just go freely backwards to the French New Wave.
Yeah, so the French New Wave is a film movement that started sort of at the very end of 50s, like 59, 58. And it lasted up until 1967. It's obviously most famous for people like Godard, Truffaut, Chabrol, Agnes Varda, Louis Malle, but also there were some of like left-bank filmmakers such as Resnais, someone who we briefly spoke about in our previous podcast. And obviously a ton of key films like Breathless, 400 Blows, Cleo from 5 to 7, Le Mépris, etc. And probably one of the most influential movements of all time.
Yeah, so a lot of these guys were actually not even filmmakers. Like, they were just a bunch of young cinephiles and who people just loved movies, and they wrote about movies before they did anything else. They were all part of André Bazin's journal called Cahiers du Cinéma. A lot of them, François Truffaut, Godard, Chabrol, Rivette, Romer, and they were all major directors later on. And I guess the one big thing that came out of that journal is I think some people know is the auteur theory.
Yep.
It was actually developed by Alexandre Astruc, who kind of formulated the concept of the camera pen, basically as like the filmmaker as a kind of writer in light, someone who is the author but in the audiovisual medium. And it's basically just saying that the best films are the ones that have this kind of personal artistic expression of the filmmaker. And this was a movement that had really like lots of directors, hundreds of films, and it was a really short, like between the around 1960 to 65 was really like kind of the main period of this movement. I guess 59. There, three of those guys that I mentioned had their feature debuts in 59, and they were all like this fresh new style that basically were destructive of like classic Hollywood, shooting with handheld cameras, elliptical editing, meta like cinema techniques, things like that.
Yeah, like for people who don't know, like a big reason why the movement started as well is that a lot of these guys, as Daniel mentioned, were film critics, or they wrote for like a film magazine, and they were quite dissatisfied with American cinema of the time, so they just started sort of doing their own film with these like 8mm cameras. And the big reason why this movement ended so quickly, because they were all so successful that actually what ended up happening is that American cinema essentially cannibalized that style, and they started doing it themselves, and that's what spawned New Hollywood cinema, and that's why sort of French New Wave came to an end, because a lot of people like Godard and Truffaut just got really discouraged by that and ended up leaving the movement, and then some other people like Romero or Rivette just started essentially moving in a different direction out of their own volition.
Yeah, exactly. So, what did you grade this as? I know this was definitely a bit tougher than the New Hollywood, for me at least.
So, an interesting bit of trivia. This was actually the movement that I started with in university. This was the very first movement that we studied, and it was the first movement that I decided to do like a little deep dive in. And when after we sort of discussed it in the lectures, I essentially just watched one film from all the big people. I watched Elevator to the Gallows from Malé. I watched Breathless from Godard. I watched 400 Blows, Cleo from 5 to 7, and a few other films. Just like essentially one film from Resnais as well. One film from all the big names. And I think this movement, for me, it's probably like a C tier. I think it can certainly be quite challenging, if not even a save for later. I think the big reason is that one of the great things about this movement is that the history of it is super interesting, with how it came about, with all the things it sort of innovated in, and how it sort of came to an end once American cinema started cannibalizing a lot of the ideas in the movement, and also just seeing all these people who ended up having like super long and interesting careers have a start all at this one sort of period of time. But I think some of the films can be quite hit or miss. Even like between someone like Godard, he famously never used any scripts in his films. So it's like for every dud, he has one masterpiece. So it's like totally hit or miss what you end up getting with Godard, but also just with some of the other people. And I think another big reason why for me this is like a C tier, can be challenging film movement, is because when I think of French cinema as a whole, I think this is like one of the least accessible time periods in terms of the films that were made. Because even though some people like Agnes Varda or Romero or Rivette got a start in the French New Wave, I think they really came into their own and started making cinema that I think is a bit more accessible a lot later on. And then actually some films that from some French films that came before the French New Wave, I think are also maybe a bit more accessible to a modern audience. Like I think certainly a lot of modern audience would have no issues, I think, enjoying like a French poetic realism film from the 40s, or even something like a Bresson film from the 50s, because those were also like super engaging and easy to enjoy. Whereas the films in the French New Wave, like there's certain things about them that require maybe a bit more bind. They're not necessarily slower, but they're very, very style forward, and some of them are a bit like more meandering in plot, and they can be slightly more challenging to enjoy to someone who's maybe just trying to experience a film movement for the first time.
Yeah. Did you say Bresson in the 50s was enjoyable?
Yeah, I think so, to be honest, because I think the big thing with Bresson is that yes, he made art house films, but I think a lot of the things that he sort of innovated upon are like the basis for a very suspenseful thrillers of like the 60s and 70s. Like particularly a film like A Man Escaped. It's super suspenseful and super tense, and I think a lot of modern audience actually wouldn't have too much difficulty enjoying that film.
Okay, yeah, I guess I was thinking more of his like austere films. I guess he was developing this austere style around the 50s. So, I would also put a lot of those in the very difficult, a more difficult tier of cinema than maybe a newcomer would be ready for. At least certainly me. I'm just thinking about my own experience. I did love A Man Escaped, I think, when I first saw it, but then I struggled more with things like, it was a later film, but Balthazar.
I think his
Pocket. Those were
60s output definitely gets a bit more challenging, but I think his 50s output is pretty easy to get into.
I think Pickpocket was also not very digestible for me when I saw it. But yeah, back to the Bresson is kind of an adjacent figure to the French New Wave. So back to the New Wave as a whole. I landed on the same rating, which was a C. And I think here's the thing about the French New Wave. I think if you explore it enough, I think you'll find like one director. Even if you're a newbie, you'll find like one director you'll probably really like, because everyone's so different. Everyone has their own eccentric style. Even I'm just thinking of someone like Jacques Demy, who would appeal to like anyone who's seen La La Land would probably really like. Who's seen and like La La Land, I should say. I would probably really like Jacques Demy, who is a big inspiration for that film. He does all these colorful musicals. But then I think like Resnais and Godard are probably two of the more difficult names of the New Wave, and I like if you take an average of all of these people, like I think it averages to around a C. I think I think your approach was honestly pretty good, where you like watched one of all of the major figures. I think that's really because everyone's so different. And kind of very important to film history. So I really think watching like Breathless and 400 Blows and Cleo from 5 to 7, all of those, getting just a good sampler of every one style and filmmaking is I think important.
And I think another big thing about the French New Wave is that it's a movement where the more you know about film history and the more you know about the films that the French New Wave influenced, the more you're going to actually get out of this movement, which is why I think it is almost like a perfect movement that you sort of enjoy maybe as your second movement or your third movement, or like slightly later down the line and slightly just delay sort of experiencing those French New Wave films, because you'll just be able to recognize more. And like I said, one of the great joys of the French New Wave is actually just learning the history and what all these people sort of went on to do later after it.
Yeah, agreed. It was definitely like the most, I think, of all of these movements, the most influential, but a little hard to quantify.
Sure.
Why don't we move on to another movement? If we continue on our sheet, we're going to go backwards in time again. So we have German Expressionism as the third movement here. I'm actually not sure how we ordered these on the sheet here. It's very strange.
It was kind of just entirely random. I was just thinking, okay, what movements would be interesting to talk about, and I just listed them randomly. I think the order works well enough.
I think it parallels how people get into films where it's kind of a random assortment of things.
True.
Figure out, piece it together, the influence and everything later. So I think it's okay. So German Expressionism. How much German Expressionist films have you seen?
I'll be honest, not that many. I've seen a couple. Well, not a couple. I've seen a few. So German Expressionism was another movement that I studied in university. Actually, I think pretty much all of these are. There's two here that I didn't study in university, but all the other ones I did. So I had that like sort of first-hand raw experience with it. And for those who don't know, German Expressionism is primarily a 1920s film movement, and it's a German movement of all like the silent films. So it includes people like Murnau, Fritz Lang, and most famously films like Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, who's now over 100 years old, Nosferatu, Metropolis, Der Golem, etc.
This is an interesting movement. So it's the oldest one we have here. So Germany at this point in time is kind of interesting because this was following World War I. And this was, if you remember the way film was made, it was made from the same chemicals used to make gunpowder. So European cinema kind of dipped following World War I because of the kind of trade-off between should we make movies or should we make gunpowder, basically. American cinema prospered, on the other hand, and kind of was like really dominant overall. So there was like a huge German effort in the 1920s to basically pump up their own cinema. They merged the kind of German production, distribution, and exhibition, like all these different companies, into a single like conglomerate that's subsidized by the government during the Weimar Republic. So this was like a big golden age where they got lots of big ambitious films. They pumped money to a lot of their artistic directors. So yeah, the names you mentioned, like Murnau and Lang, definitely the two big names of this. It's really like German Expressionism nowadays. Like it's still kind of like, unlike a lot of these, like French New Wave is, I guess there are characteristics that thread all of those films together, I suppose. But German Expressionism, like, it has a really distinct style. That is shared between Lang and Murnau, where they use light and shadow and like unconventional angles, performances that are really exaggerated, like focus on like emotions and more so than like truth. This was a movement that was trying to depict what like a human soul was about, not necessarily like what was real. Like we'll go into more realistic movements shortly after this, but yeah, this is the most like stylized, least realistic movement, I think I would say, of all of these.
Yeah, for those who don't know, like Expressionism in arts as a whole, not just in film, like the point of Expressionism is that essentially you're expressing internal emotions through external things. So for instance, if your mind is like really twisted, you might see a building, and in Expressionism that building would be really twisted. Like the most famous Expressionist painting is that one of like the man screaming on the bridge, and where his face is like all wobbly, it's like a squiggly line. It's sort of like that same sort of concept where like the whole scenery expresses his internal state of mind. And German Expressionism in particular focused on these like really almost like mentally unstable dark characters, and so a lot of the films like had these really like sharp geometrical angles, and they really played a lot with high contrast and shadows. Like in particular a film like Nosferatu, super famous for how it used the shadows. M as well, which is actually not a silent film, but it also is super famous for that German Expressionism high contrast usage of shadows as well.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. America stole both Lang and Murnau at a certain point. And then they...
not just them as well.
Hollywood. Yeah, they stole a lot of European directors. I mean, Germany in the 30s was definitely a time where people were fleeing. German Expressionism was kind of this period in the 20s, and I guess spilled over to the 30s, but it really, you can see its influence still today. Someone like Tim Burton, who... a lot of his sets are, if you ever notice his funky looking sets, trace them back to like the exaggerated sets and decor of this German Expressionist films.
And obviously not just Tim Burton. Like later this year, obviously the remake of the Nosferatu, the silent film, is coming out, and it's directed by Robert Eggers, the guy who did The Witch, Lighthouse. The Lighthouse in itself is super influenced by German Expressionism, but also he did The Northman, and he's making like supposedly a quite accurate remake of the film. I presume it's going to be a sound film. I would be quite shocked if it just comes out of a silent film, but yeah, it's supposedly a very, very accurate, true to source material adaptation. But yeah, I think in terms of German Expressionism itself, on the one hand, it is a silent film movement, so I know it does require quite a lot of buy-in from a modern audience to actually engage with it, because a lot of people are just kind of put off by that fact. It's old, it looks old, there's no spoken language, it's just music. But I actually think out of all the silent film, not even movements, like all silent films, I think this is one of the easiest ones to get into, maybe even the easiest one. And I think generally I would put it as high as B tier, which is fun to explore. And the big reason for that is that I think, as Daniel mentioned, it's very style forward, but in a slightly different way from the French New Wave, in that the style is super easy to pick up on, even for someone who isn't like super serious about film. Like a lot of people, their first experience with German Expressionism is just watching a film like Cabinet of Dr. Caligari on Halloween because it's a horror film. And they see it, and the thing also about German Expressionism is that yeah, I'm pretty sure it is the smallest movement here because there's only like 20 or 30 German Expressionism films that we have. There were more made, but a lot of them were also lost because, especially during the Second World War, a lot of that film just didn't survive. So like, for instance, Der Golem, there were like 7 Der Golem films, but only one survived, and it's actually a prequel of all those other Golem films. But I think because...
Yeah, it's very, very tragic.
Yeah. It's certainly, even a film like Metropolis to this day, I'm pretty sure it isn't fully finished. There's still like a couple scenes that are missing from it, unfortunately.
Yeah. I haven't peeked at your sheet, but I also had the same grade as B. The thing about silent films that is a bit deceptive is it's like, obviously it's the oldest type of film. These were films made almost or more than 100 years ago, and you might think these are the most dated films. Like, how could anyone, new to film really watch these? If you actually sit down and watch, like, the people who are new to silent films, like this, silent films, I think, are really surprisingly pretty accessible. Like, at least the way I found them. And for like the Zoomer no attention span generation, I think a lot of them move pretty quickly and have quite a lot going on, especially visually. Like, because of, the lack of sound. They really focused on making these, being heavily visually stylized and pushing the boundaries kind of in the types of techniques used for visual storytelling. And I just think if you like creativity on screen and a lot of these are not, like, the plot's kind of important, but like not, it's more about the visual experience, I would say. Like, the appeal for something like Metropolis or Nosferatu or Caligari. Like, I feel like that's what makes them classics. And I just think they're a lot more accessible than, a lot of other films. Especially I would say, like, the 30s through 50s period of, like, Hollywood and cinema is a bit, I'd say, even tougher than silent films to get into. But that's just my opinion. I think I'm a big backer of silent films.
Yeah, and even if you look at like the German Expressionism, which is like technically it's no longer part of Expressionism, which is like a film like M, which is just a thriller. It has a sound and everything, and it has a lot of those characteristics. It's just it is totally like a modern thriller. Like, it's almost like mind-blowing that this film was made in like 1931, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, another big thing with Expressionism is that I think one of the big joys about actually exploring a movement is that then you get to see all the influence that it had on films when you watch like some of the other films. And I think with German Expressionism, it's super noticeable because it's so style forward. You can watch as little as like 1 or 2 films, and you'll notice that influence in a ton of million other works, especially since, as Daniel mentioned as well, a lot of these figures also migrated to America. So like Murnau, Lang, they made some American films as well, but also guys like Karl Freund, who was the cinematographer for Metropolis, he then moved on to America, where he directed some of the horror films like The Mummy that America came out with in the 1930s, but also like obviously film noir massively influenced by German Expressionism and a lot of those other like sort of 30s and 40s American movements, and some like modern directors like Tim Burton as well.
Yeah, it's a good point about noir and subsequent films as well. Like, I think the visual innovations of the German Expressionist movement just are really important, and you could trace them throughout film history. Anything that uses light and shadow in cool ways, you could probably link back to Expressionism in some way.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Why don't we go, if you want to go across the globe, I don't have a segue for this, so we can just go straight into
our first Asian movement here. Yeah.
First Asian movement. Yeah, we have here the Taiwanese New Wave. It's also a slightly dubious term, but it's, people still use it.
True.
So, yeah. What's your familiarity with the Taiwanese New Wave?
So I mentioned that I studied in university all of these movements except one, and this was the one that I didn't have any university familiarity with. So I mostly just explored it actually quite recently, like a year last year and like a year prior is when I really sort of familiarized with the people in this movement, which is directors like Edward Yang, Hao Xiao-shen, and Tsai Ming-liang, and films in particular like A Brighter Summer Day that people know about, Yi Yi, Rebels of the Neon God, A City of Sadness, etc. And these films, and in particular, like if someone hasn't necessarily heard of or seen of these filmmakers, they might be familiar with the Hong Kong filmmaker Wong Kar-wai. And these films are a bit similar to him. They're not as stylistic or visually flashy, but they have that same sort of thematic focus on people who are sort of alienated by the modern world, modern society. And so a lot of the films are about sort of themes of loneliness, alienation, and that sort of internal sadness of the modern world, essentially.
Yeah, so I mean, to trace it back to Taiwan's history, Taiwan went through a lot of traumatic events. Like, following World War II, like it was under Japanese rule for a while, and then it eventually was liberated from that, but then was taken over by China, and then it from like 49 through 87, it was under martial law by the nationalist government of China, and there were, obviously the people were not very free, and the liberties for filmmakers to do things were pretty poor until 87 in particular. But yeah, so there was a lot of kind of trauma, a lot of problems of society and people's lives that I think were resonant and filmmakers wanted to touch upon when it started. It started in 82, I think, was the kind of official year. There's this film called In Our Time. It was just this compendium film by Edward Yang and a few other filmmakers I'm not familiar with. And then eventually, there's kind of like, I guess, multiple waves with this that's kind of lumped together as like, I guess, a single one. But yeah, Tsai Ming-liang is, I guess, kind of known as following Edward Yang and Hou Xiaoshen and a few others. But those three are kind of the biggest names, I would say, from Taiwan at this time.
Yeah.
And they're all like, this was, again, we're now going away from heavy stylization into realistic depictions of people, social reality, looks at like what are the common people going through. And then once martial law was lifted in 87, then like, even more taboo topics were explored. Things like how, Taiwan's oppression under China, Hou Xiaoshen made a trilogy of films that dug into Taiwan's modern history and, the kind of traumatic events that people were subjected to, the country was subjected to in those times. So, very different than German Expressionism. And I think it's kind of interesting. We've done, this is like, I guess the first more quote unquote realistic movement we're doing, but we haven't done the original realistic movement. We'll get to that. But how would you grade this wave, this new wave or movement, I should say?
So I think, interestingly, although it is one of the more modern movements here, and it's one of my favorite movements here, I really love the films from this movement. But I think a big problem with it is, especially for like someone who's a bit newer to film, is that they do require a lot of buy-in from the audience member. Like that anecdote I told with Wells earlier in the podcast. Like these films do certainly linger for a lot of time on certain shots, and you have to really sort of care about those shots for them to sort of mean something to you. So they do definitely require a lot of patience. And because of that, even though I do like this movement, I think this for me has to go to one of the two bottom tiers, either a save for later or a do not start with this movement. Because I just think for a modern audience, the problem they're going to have is that even though some of these films are certainly more accessible than others, like there's certainly a risk that a lot of them might just leave you bored if you come into them with the sort of wrong mindset and you expect something like really exciting and flashy, whereas these films are certainly very slow and methodical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So did you agree? Did you put it in D?
I think I would lean towards E actually. I think this is a sort
wow.
of. I think if this is your first. If this is your first movement that you sort of start with, I think you run the risk of potentially getting burnt out or put off older films as a whole. And I think actually if you do save it for later and explore it once you have maybe built up some familiarity with particularly European films that are also slightly slower, films by people like Antonioni, for instance, and then go into this movement, I think you will get significantly more out of it than you did if you just sort of dived into it head first.
Yeah, I didn't go that that far down, but I mean
that's fair. I'd also be happy to put it in D. I was just sort of like between those two, I think.
Mm. Yeah, I was actually between C and D.
Okay.
And I think you make a good point. These are, I'd say all three of those figures, they're very slow, lots of long shots, very easy to get bored for, especially for the zoomer type or like just a small attention span type of people. But the appeal of these films, and especially Yang in particular, those three names, are the really humanist characters, the stories, the themes. Like these are some of you. Like you're not going to find really. Maybe you can, but it'll be hard pressed to find more realistic and humanist depictions of people and kind of, especially in urban settings. Like at least for me, it was a very resonant. It's a very resonant movement for me in particular.
Yeah.
And I think I watched Yi. This was probably the first one I watched of this movement. And I don't think I started with it. This was definitely not a movement I started with, but it was, it was among maybe the first of many films I was watching.
Yeah.
And it bowled me over. Like it was, it convinced me that I think I would like a lot more of what Yang in particular had to offer.
Yeah, I think if you're gonna start with this movement, Edward Yang would probably be the best starting spot out of these three sort of directors, particularly a film like Yi. It certainly has a lot more. A lot of times people, this is like a screenwriting pet peeve. A lot of times people say this thing, "Oh, that film has no plot," which sort of like doesn't make sense because what plot actually is just anything happening in a film is plot, and what they often mean is that a film doesn't have plot points, which is like a big event in a film that sort of changes the course of events. So a lot of these films are sort of films that don't have a lot of plot points, but Edward Yang's films, I don't think really. Well, some of them do. Like I think Taipei Story certainly doesn't have a lot of plot points, but Yi is quite an engaging film, even though it is certainly long.
Yeah, I don't think it's very plot heavy. It's more like situation based, I'd say. And these films have a lot of dialogue, especially Yang's films. And it's the kind of the real poetic quality of Yi, A Brighter Summer Day, is in these characters and how they navigate this world and the other people in it. So, yeah, I think D is probably a good compromise.
Yeah, I think I'm happy with D. Like I said, I was between those two, and that means now we have a film in nearly every tier except the bottom one. We'll see if we do end up putting something in that bottom tier eventually. Right, but the next movement that we have is Japanese Golden Age, which is primarily a 1950s movement that comprises of people like Ozu, Kurosawa, Kobayashi, and of course films like Seven Samurai, Tokyo Story, or the Human Condition trilogy. And it's actually a movement I'm not too familiar with. Like I've seen Tokyo Story, I've seen a couple of 50s Kurosawa films, and I think I've seen one Kobayashi film. But other than that, Japanese cinema is one of like my bigger blind spots. Like I just haven't seen all that many Golden Age or even later Japanese films, to be honest. So I'll let you take it away on this one.
You got to rectify that. Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say there's probably a lot of Japanese films. Like I wouldn't say I'm super knowledgeable about Japanese films in general, but I have seen quite a bit of the Golden Age era because I do really like this period. So the Golden Age, this followed World War II, And as we know from history, Japan was pretty devastated by World War II. But surprisingly, their studios were kept mostly intact, and they continued to produce films, even just starting from 1945 onward. And they were occupied by the Allies, and so they did enforce restrictions on the type of subjects that were, they were able to depict in film. So anything that kind of promoted feudalism was prohibited. So like a lot of period dramas only came a bit later. Really, the first one that broke through was Rashomon in 1950. It really brought international attention to Japanese cinema. It won the Golden Lion at the Venice Film Festival in '51. It really just brought new export markets of Japanese cinema to the West. And that's really when the 50s onwards is when all the directors you name made some of their best work. And so Kurosawa, the director of Rashomon, I'd say he's definitely, like, if I had to rank all of the directors just forgetting movements, Kurosawa's probably like maybe the first or second director I'd recommend to someone new to film.
Yeah, for sure.
I should say older foreign director, because his films, some people criticize him for this, but they have kind of a Western sensibility, even though he was Japanese. He made like samurai films, which I think a lot of them are pretty action-packed and incredibly engaging for even for modern audiences. And then he even made when he made contemporary dramas, something like Akiru or High and Low. Those are really, I'd say, like emotional films that I think modern audiences still really respond to and love. But then when you get to other figures like Mizoguchi and Ozu, those guys are a little more difficult, and they're definitely more, I'd say, quote unquote Japanese. I just mean in the type of subjects they were depicting. Mizoguchi's films were, I'd say both of them actually had a lot more long takes, a lot more were about Mizoguchi in particular was about like critiques of feudalism, focused on the condition of women within the social order. And Ozu's were about like lower middle class families. He made 54 films, and they were all like basically very like almost the same film. Yeah. You could think of them as like a single large film with the like one subject, which was like about ordinary lives of ordinary people. Very minimalist style, and they were just all shot within like the confines of a Japanese house. Usually very low angle takes, meeting people like because people are sitting on the floor in basically all these films as in Japanese houses. So you kind of meet them at their eye level, which is pretty interesting and is very, very distinctive. But yeah, those two guys are a lot harder to get into than Kurosawa, who I would say is almost a surefire a director for someone new to film. To like. So that brings me to my overall grade of a B.
Okay.
Because I think Kurosawa would be like A plus. Ozu, Mizoguchi, I think you could really like them. They definitely rely more. I guess they have a little bit more in common with the Taiwanese New Wave, especially Ozu, as just like longer takes, focused more on these characters, their relationships, how they navigate the particular worlds they're in. I think it balances out to around a B. But how about you? I guess you said you didn't have a lot of familiarity. I don't know if you gave a grade.
Yeah, I think if I would have, I didn't really give a grade. I think I'm just happy to go along with what you decided. But I think if I were to give a grade, it probably would be like a C. I think, which can be challenging, because I think like Kurosawa, as you mentioned, is I think very accessible for Western audiences. He is truly one of the great screenwriters and put together very, very compelling and interesting stories, like Seven Samurai in particular. Super engaging film. And also like he also did like a bunch of Western adaptations, like a bunch of Shakespeare adaptations even in this time period and films like that. So I think he's super accessible and easy to engage with. I think the only reason I'd have for C is because that sort of reflects my experience. Like I really liked some Kurosawa films, watched a couple Ozu films, didn't really connect with them too much. So that's just sort of like my experience has been hit and miss. And I think the only other thing I can think of is that I think maybe for someone with very modern sensibilities, it can take a little bit of time to adapt to Japanese cinema, because I think more than almost any other cinema, it has a very distinct look and feel, in the sense that I think Japanese performances are almost like fundamentally different to how performances are handled in the West, and I think that could maybe put off some people who aren't really used to it. And it certainly, like when I was watching Seven Samurai, it certainly took a little bit of time for me to sort of get used to and sort of buy into the film. Oh, okay, so that's how they sort of express themselves. Okay, that's how action is done. Okay, this all makes sense now. Now I'm sort of on board and on the train and happy to go along with it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'd say in the example of like those period dramas like Kurosawa's and Mizoguchi's films, they are informed a lot by Japanese theater, and those performances are quite theatrical. But Ozu, on the contrary, is very like the opposite. So it's you get kind of both sides of that. Like you get very expressive, and then you'll get like very quiet, very subtle. So yeah, how about we put it behind German Expressionist on the B tier?
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. We can jump to the next movement, which is we're going back in time again, jumping back into Europe after two Asian movements in a row, and we're moving to Italian neorealism. But primarily, so Italian neorealism is one of those where I mentioned that definitions can be a bit contentious here. Like, some people believe Italian neorealism only lasted like 1 or 2 years. Like, it started in 44, and by 46 it was over. Like, all the ideals of neorealism films were sort of dead by then. Others believe that it only ended in like 1952, and it lasted a lot longer. They even incorporate some Italian pink neorealism films into like the neorealism movement, which is essentially like the comedy branch of neorealism. So for those who don't know, neorealism is mainly comprises of people like Rossellini, whom Federico Fellini famously wrote some screenplays for, Vittorio De Sica, Luchino Visconti, and some other names that sort of really started the movement, and films like Bicycle Thieves, super famous and known film, Rome Open City, La Terra Trema, and others. And what this movement really did, so during the years when Mussolini was in power, he essentially created a film movement known as Italian realism, and it was essentially just a propaganda movement. Like, it essentially showed how great Italy was under Mussolini, and what these filmmakers did is essentially when Second World War ended and Italy was left in like absolute devastation, total ruins, they essentially showed the new realism, the actual new reality of what Mussolini's government did now that they were in sort of under the confines of censorship. And they shot all of these films with non-actors. If some of the films had actors, usually they only played like very, very minor parts. They shot all of them in location, in particular on location on like the ruins of Italy, like the big cities among like the collapsing buildings, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess it's a good follow-up to the Japanese Golden Age, because it was basically kind of arrived of similar circumstances following World War II. Italy actually surrendered pretty early, so that was actually a pretty good move for their film industries, because it left all their facilities intact. And yeah, as you're talking about Mussolini, he actually made this. He had this. I think it was a school called Centro Sperimentale, and basically all the major figures of the neorealist movement studied there, and they eventually like rejected the stagey, artificial style of Italian films at that time. They were called Telefono Bianco films. These were like very, like kind of Hollywood-esque, comedies, artificial, like, I haven't seen any in particular, but these were just the popular Italian comedy films at the time. But they instead pursued like a very Marxist aesthetic of like everyday life. So yeah, the Visconti, De Sica, Rossellini, the three of the major guys who were kind of the forefronts of this movement. And then Rome Open City was the first that really brought international attention. Yeah. Even though Visconti's film was it translates to obsession, I think. In 1942 was the first, but it was suppressed. But yeah, a lot of the hallmarks of the movements are apparent in every film, which are like it used non-professional actors, focused on like ordinary people caught up in pretty contemporary events, very documentary-like kind of, and all of them had like a post-recorded soundtrack, shot on location, used natural lighting, etc. Again, another rejection of like Hollywood in terms of their narrative conventions, and I know we said the French New Wave was, at least I said it was the most influential, but this was kind of like the root of like basically every other post-World War II movement, or a lot of them.
Yeah, I mean, this directly inspired French New Wave. It was one of the big influences for it. Yeah.
Yeah, and even ones that were kind of responses to neorealism, I still say that counts as an influence. But yeah, this is an influence to so many world cinema movements as well. So yeah, and I guess just to put a bow on the historical context, this ended in like the 50s because Italy actually began to prosper due to things like the Marshall Plan, things like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, what was your overall grade?
So initially, when I was like when I first put it down on my list, I thought this was like almost like a slam dunk for E tier, which is do not start with this movement. But then the more I thought about it, the more I thought actually like low-key this kind of has some bangers in it. Like I think a film like Bicycle Thieves, it's almost like a 40s sort of equivalent of a film like 12 Angry Men. Like it's a very simple story, a very heartfelt story, very easy to enjoy for sort of like anyone, even like a modern viewer. It's so sort of simple and stripped down that it'll likely move you even if you do not sort of have the patience for older films. But then also films like Rome Open City. This is going to be some big spoiler, so if you do not want to hear to skip ahead like 30 seconds. But Rome Open City was, as far as I know, the first film which did that film where they cast a famous actress in one of the key roles, and then the actress got killed like halfway through the film, which was like a super shocking like plot twist where like, whoa, you totally don't expect, you think like, oh, she's actually the star of the show, the film is about her, and then she just suddenly dies halfway through the film. It's like this crazy plot twist that you totally don't see coming. And I think like almost due to their simplicity, these films are quite easy to enjoy. I still want to go above like a C tier because I think it's not a very bingeable movement. Like if you decide, oh yeah, I'm gonna deep dive neorealism, and you watch like 5 films in a week, I think you might, I don't know, I think you might get a bit exhausted because they are also quite similar to one another in some, like they all deal with like pretty similar themes and are pretty similar in how they were made. So I don't think it's a super like bingeable movement. But the history around it's super interesting. The influence of it is also like really interesting if you're sort of into that aspect of the movements, of learning more about them, learning about the figures that come from them, etc. And I think the films are actually like quite easy to enjoy for the most part.
So you're telling me Wes Craven wasn't the first to kill off his leading star of a film? That's interesting. Yes. I put it in the C tier, and that's because, well, for one, like I think this is undeniably a movement everyone should see, and probably earlier on than later, at least like 1 or 2 films. You don't have to binge it. I do think, these are pretty. I haven't seen any that I'd call light. These are all like pretty serious, sad, dramatic films. And sometimes maybe even too dramatic for modern sensibilities, but I mean, I think, as we're talking about influence, and I mean, I don't want to detract from the films at all. A lot of them are still very powerful, I would say. Bicycle Thieves, Rome Open City, they all have real moments of there's a point in the film, like, and I'd say like all the films I've seen, I've only seen a small handful, and like basically every film there's a point of like just pure like a gut punch, basically, like you feel, oh man, like I don't think I've weeped at any of them, but like I could probably imagine myself in the right circumstances just just crying to some of the things I'm seeing.
I think they actually benefit from a similar thing that some Bresson films benefit from, which is the fact that they use non-actors. And essentially what happens when the actor doesn't express a certain emotion and it's almost like repressed within them, the audience essentially gets to internalize and experience that emotion that isn't expressed by the actor. And that's actually something Bresson spoke about in his not autobiography, but how like his book, or like his thoughts on filmmaking, etc. Like that's like something, a deliberate choice he made for that specific reason. And I think some of these films also benefit because of that. Like certainly a film like if you're gonna watch any neorealism film, certainly I think Bicycle Thieves is a really, really good starting point.
Yeah. So should we put it in the C tier?
Yeah, I'm happy with C tier.
Above or below French New Wave?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Where are you leaning on this one?
I'd probably put it below French New Wave.
I was gonna say, because I was just thinking back on my experience in university, and I was thinking like, not just of myself, but like other people, and I feel like on average more students that I studied with enjoyed the one neorealism film that we watched than the one French New Wave film that we checked out for the lecture. But I'm also happy to put it below it as well.
That's the thing, is like if you only watch one French New Wave film, it could be very hit or miss.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But like if you do watch one of the realist classics, it's like hard to go wrong. I think they've all, a lot of them considered.
Yeah, I think it is an older movement, so it makes sense to realistically put it below French New Wave.
Okay. All right, so we're at our last movement for this episode. What is this last movement?
So the last movement is another new wave, and this is the Czech New Wave. It also started in the 60s, so a bit later than the French New Wave, and it's famous for filmmakers such as Juraj Hirsch, Vera Chytilova, and Obsti Miloš Forman, who then went on to America and made a bunch of like quite famous films. But the films in the actual Czech New Wave that most people would know as films like The Cremator, Daisies, Closely Watched Trains, Valerie and Her Week of Wonders, and a bunch of other films.
Yeah, this was a period, like, stop me if you've heard this before, but it was a period of a lot of formal experimentation from filmmakers who were rebelling against a large system of some sort. And yeah, really just doing this a lot of the times with not much budget, not much experience, just kind of making stuff. So the historical context. This was a period where the Czech, I should say, this is Czechoslovakia at the time.
Yes.
So they were under the rule of the Soviet Republic, the Soviet Union.
Yeah. So for people who don't know, essentially, they weren't technically part of the Soviet Union in a sense that they weren't absorbed into the actual country like some of the other nations, like say the Baltic states, but they were part of the Warsaw Pact and were effectively ruled by the Soviet Union, even though like in theory they weren't, but they actually were. That's why a thing like the Prague Spring, which was essentially a revolution when they tried to sort of free themselves from Soviet control, was a thing. They were effectively ruled by Soviet Union. That is very much reflected in a lot of these films.
They were under a lot of oppression at the time, and film was used as this political tool to basically fight back against the things that they were kind of forbidden to do. So I mean, the filmmakers were in a lot of trouble with the censors, and a lot of the films got banned, and some of the filmmakers got exiled at certain points as well. The Prague Spring was kind of the collapse of this new wave and of kind of the freedom, the Czechoslovak film industry. So in 1968, there was a period of reformation actually happening, where there was some resistance, and there's a new president, Alexander Dubček, I think. In 68. So, reforms were happening and censors were starting to be lifted until the Soviets invaded later that year in 68. And then that's that's when there's like a swift banning of like basically every new wave film. The whole film industry reorganized, and then guys like Foreman and Nemec all were exiled, and found at least Foreman was able to find a country elsewhere in the United States to eventually work in. But yeah, the films themselves have a lot of formal experimentation. It's a good pairing with the French New Wave because, especially the use of editing and a lot of these, they're very crazy. Some of the editing techniques and a lot of them. I guess how would you even describe them? It's like they're pieced together in a way that is really kind of frenetic, but it's kind of like just like when you watch a lot of these films are very short. They're like an hour, 20 hour, 30 minutes long, but within that time, like contains so many different cuts and every sort of technique. I don't know. How would you describe these films?
Yeah, sort of. I made a very similar note as you, is that the biggest focus on these films, I think, is on the editing. Like a film like The Cremator and Daisies in particular, super groundbreaking in terms of the editing techniques used. And that's almost like certainly they have very sort of creative sets and costumes as well. But that's like the main sort of crux where the creativity of a lot of these films is expressed. And I think that's also part of the reason why I personally put this movement lower on my tier list. I think a problem that you have is to get the most out of the Czech New Wave. It does kind of require quite a bit of context, sometimes of the time when the film was made, the circumstances that Czechoslovakia was in. The circumstances of the Soviet Union as a whole, what was like in the Soviet Union, because one aspect of these films as well is that they're very comedic in a very sort of like black humor way, where they're sort of making fun of certain aspects of the Soviet life and the hypocrisy within it. And because of that, I think it can be a little challenging to engage with. Like, you really have to care about things like editing and really care enough about the history behind the Czech New Wave to really sort of delve into the circumstances of the time. And that's why I think it can be a little tricky for new people to navigate this movement.
Interesting. I was a bit higher on this. I guess part of it was I did actually show Daisies to a group of like non-cinema people, although they agreed to it. So it wasn't like I was just subjecting them to art house films.
Yeah.
Hey
guys, have a fun, engaging film.
Yeah,
Daisies.
I don't know if they'd be my friends for that much longer. But no, they found it really interesting, and I think they really liked it. I think something like Daisies is pretty accessible to, well, not everyone, but to some people who really appreciate things like editing. I go back always to that attention span, and I feel like, especially films like Daisies, maybe a few others. Yeah, maybe like Valerie and a Week of Wonders also. But I mean, some of these do feel still pretty fresh, and like they're just kind of a flurry of, at least Daisies is a flurry of like cuts and colors and madness, just kind of silliness. No plot really, just vibes. So I was going between a C or a B, to be honest, but I can lean downward if you want to agree on a C.
I'll be honest, I did put it in D. I thought this is a movement that is best enjoyed as when it is like sort of saved later. But I do get where you're coming from, because similarly to German Expressionism, a lot of the style is also pretty out there, and it isn't like impossible to become, like you need to be like some turbo cinephile to notice the genius of these films. No, it's like pretty apparent that The Cremator has like really crazy and creative editing for people who even aren't super into films.
Yeah, I was probably a little too high on that Daisy showing, but yeah, we could put it in C. Okay. Above, below New Wave, French New Wave, or Italian Neorealism? How do you rank these three?
Oh, I would probably put it below those two. I think that the average the average film, again, it's really hard to determine what the actual average film is in any of these movements, but I think the average French New Wave or Italian Neorealism movement might have a more, like a story that has slightly broader appeal than a Czech New Wave films. Like, I wouldn't say a lot of those have like a very broad appeal films. Like, they do sort of appeal to a specific niche, and that specific niche absolutely loves them. So if you are in that niche, like if you want to check out like one film and see if you're sort of into it, then yeah, by all means. But whether you like it as a whole, it's a bit sort of more up in the air, and it might be a thing that you might appreciate it more when you do get a taste of other movements and you sort of learn a bit more about film editing and start to appreciate it a bit more as well.
I should also say fans of Christopher Nolan's Tenet should check out the film Happy End by Lipsky. That's how it's pronounced. It has a very similar concept and conceit. So, yeah. So, okay. I think I can recap all of our tiers. Let's see.
Okay.
So, from top down, in A tier we have New Hollywood, the very top alone.
Everyone would love this.
B tier we have, B tier we have German Expressionism, and followed by a Japanese Golden Age. In C tier we have French New Wave, Italian Neorealism, and then Czechoslovakia New Wave. And then D tier we have the Taiwanese New Wave.
Sounds good to me.
Pretty good distribution. Yeah, but let's see. Anything else you wanted to say about these movements?
How much you get out of exploring a movement sort of does largely depend on you as well. Like, how much patience are you willing to give it? How much are you able to sort of not necessarily put up with, but how much disbelief are you willing to suspend, and how much sort of are you willing to put forward yourself in terms of not only watching the films but also doing a bit of research, like looking up some of these names, because like the more you know about let's say French New Wave, the more you're actually going to get out of the films in it as well, I'd say.
Yeah, I do think some patience is required on the viewer's part, and not just with one film, but probably at least a small handful. This is kind of how I still watch, or at least I try to. But I always enjoy just spending like, I don't know, a couple weeks, maybe even more, on like one particular movement or country, and then just kind of seeing some of the films and within that. Some people watch by like director or like, I don't know, or just whatever they want to. But I like having a sort of structure where you get like a movement or a region of the world, time, place to guide you.
Here's a question that I was wondering. So obviously there's a bunch of movements that we didn't cover, and I was wondering, just as like a little teaser for like maybe if we do a sequel potentially and cover some more movements, do you think there is a movement that would be more accessible than New Hollywood cinema?
No.
Oh, okay.
I'm looking at our list. I don't think I'd put any. There may be one or I don't know if there is more than one that I'd put in the A tier.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. It's really difficult to like, especially when you get into film. It's like nothing is going to appeal to everyone. And I don't know. I'm always more dubious on what appeals to people than maybe other people are. So, yeah, like, I don't know. I think that A tier would be pretty small if I did every single movement. Yeah.
I think there is one for me that could dethrone it in the future. I'm not going to say what it is now. I'll save that as like a suspense piece for people who are listening to look forward to eventually when we might cover it and talk about that movement as well.
Tune in next year when we talk about this again.
Yeah, shall we cap off the episode and do our classic end of episode recommendations?
Yeah. Why don't you go ahead and lead us off?
Go ahead. Okay, well, for the first two episodes, I was a bit rebellious and opted to not recommend any films, and I wanted to keep that trend going, but I actually didn't read anything super exciting since the previous two episodes. So this time I actually do have a film, and it's a film I watched recently. It's a film called White Buffalo, which is a horror western from the 70s starring Charles Bronson. So a couple of the people we know have been doing this massive Charles Bronson marathon where they watch like all of the Charles Bronson films, and now they've sort of been rewatching some of the best films from that marathon, and White Buffalo was one of them. And I joined when they saw it, and I really love that film. Like, I think that just really appealed to my sensibilities. Like, I think the mixture of horror and Western is just, it's right up my alley.
Interesting. Yeah, I think those people that like the Bronson films appreciate the shout out. So
they better.
Yeah. Great. I actually am not familiar with this film. So.
It is like a very obscure film, to be fair. But if you do like 70s like Western or 70s action films, do check it out. Like, I think it's one of the better Bronsons for sure.
Yes. For me, one day I'll recommend a book. I just haven't been reading much lately. I will recommend another film. I went to a film festival not last week, the week before. And I only saw a few films. I wasn't there for too long. But I wanted to catch this one film in particular. It's Radu Jude's Do Not Expect Too Much from the End of the World.
Okay.
So Radu Jude is a Romanian filmmaker. And this was the first film of his I saw. And then I watched one more of his films kind of recently. This was quite unlike other... Like, I don't want to say too much about it. Because part of the joy in it was how surprising and unexpected it was.
Yeah.
A lot of, especially in the filmmaking, the formalist techniques used. Anyone who's familiar with structuralism, the kind of the experimental film movement, which is about how like filmmakers, instead of creating like a narrative, based cinema, it's experimental. So it really just based around filmmaking techniques. And that's the structure of the film, basically. And I wouldn't say this is a structuralist film, but there are parts of it that could constitute that. That's all I'll say.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild film set in contemporary Romania, ostensibly about a woman interviewing victims of workplace accidents. I won't say exactly what happens from there.
Is it a documentary film then?
No, but it has there are flourishes that have real life, I guess I should say. Yeah, it's just a pretty strange, weird film, and it had there's one detour towards, I guess, maybe the 2/3 or end of the film where it turns into completely like a silent film for a little bit, and then audience members that I was watching the film with just started discussing and mocking the film and leaving. It was really quite surreal. Pretty entertaining, actually. So yeah, it's, I mean, definitely not we're talking about accessibility this whole episode. This is definitely not A or B or maybe even C tier film. Would highly, though, recommend for anyone who wants to watch something new that feels completely unlike anything you've seen before.
That sounds interesting. Well, I think that's going to be it from us this week. We are going to be back in about a couple of weeks. If you listened to this and you enjoyed the episode, give us a 5-star review, share it with your friends, all that fun stuff. We'll return with some more episodes soon.
Yes, thank you for watching, and we'll hope to release some more content soon.